around and kind of show you. So here are the prints I made. These are extended gamut prints. So they're made with your normal cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. But I also added in violet, orange, kind of a reddish orange, and green. So one of the beautiful things about this is I can do a clear coat in between each layers. So there's practically no staining on this, whereas I've done extended gamut prints in carbon, and it's much more difficult to do clear coats between layers. So you can see how much more vibrant that red is in this print than the carbon print. And if we compare this to some of my carbon prints up here, well, this is that gum print in the book. So much more vibrant. And here's a photo by Michael Strickland. So also much more vibrant. And this is a glossy finish to it. Or you can also do, matte finish. And then I also made a just normal CMYK. Colors are pretty good, but they're not great. The reason why the colors aren't that great on this, which I explain in my book on color calibration, is when you are choosing densities for your, so this is, for example, carbon up here. When you're choosing your densities, you don't want to go too high, or else you're going to run into problems with color casts. So I was just playing around with this new emulsion, and I kind of wanted to see how far I could go. So you can see that this is, let me pull this up here. So this is the magenta, for example, my light magenta and magenta. So this is carbon, this is the new emulsion, and then this is my density for cyan. And you can see how much more vibrant the colors are too. Like just this cyan, if you compare these two side by side, because it has no sensitizer staining, like it doesn't yellow like you would with dichromate or diazo or diazeto, you get just much more vibrant colors. So these were all made with image setter negatives. But my goal with this is to make it as easy and accessible as possible. So, if I'm working with image setter negatives, it's just, you can see, these are all just, perfect from, 0 to 100%. The white point is perfect. All I did, drop my negative here. Let's flip this around here. So with image setter negatives, it's very easy, and I'm able to do those clear coats and everything. And but my goal with this is to make it as accessible as possible. So I want people to be able to make prints with inkjet negatives, with analog negatives, and I have ideas for making it even easier than that too. So let's look at what we've got going on here. So let's organize this a little bit. Okay, so I've got a little, let me put you up on a tripod here. So the first thing we need to try to achieve is a good tonal scale. So I've done some tests, and it has a pretty similar tonal response to gum. So just taking a little Stouffer step wedge and exposing. This is about, what you'd get from just a single layer of this new emulsion of the PrintMaker's friend. It's not great. It's kind of blocked up here, so I can reduce exposure. It's not terrible. And so I talk about this in the book, why that happens and why it's easy to use image setter. But we need to figure out some way to easily get around that so that we can print something that has a more complete tonal range like this. You know, really nice highlights going into the shadows, nice separations. So how can we achieve that? Well, if we make tonal separations, but not with the negative itself. So making the tonal separations with the negative is quite complicated. But if we do it through the exposures and changing the pigment concentration, like I had done with, I don't know if you guys remember this, I did this with carbon a couple years back. So making tonal separations. So here I just kind of bracketed the first layer. So I've got 5 units, or I don't know what this was, 5 minutes, 6 minutes, 7 minutes. And then you have your second layer, which if I flip this over so you can kind of see, we have increasing this way tonality. So if I do a really short exposure, well, it's just going to add tone to the trees. But if I increase the exposure time, it's going to expose more and more of the tonal scale. So if I flip this and put this on top of this, well, all of a sudden you start to get a full tonal range. So I want to do that same thing where you're exposing for, let's say, a very short amount of time, which would be something like this. And you're just going to get the, start of the tonal, or the end of the tonal range here, and a long amount of time. So here you're just getting the tone at the end and nothing here. So if we can combine these two, well, then we can get, a more complete tonal range. So how are we going to do this? And another way to think of this is if we go over to kind of explain this in the books, we're just doing layers on top of layers, if that makes sense. Let me draw this out as well.
I think typing, could you mute your screen, please?
Yeah. Yeah. Anybody who has if everybody mutes it, that'd be perfect. And at the end, I'll answer some questions. Or if you have a question during, you can ask it too. So let's say that this is our piece of paper, and we coat an emulsion on top of this. I talk about how, if our exposure unit is up here, how this gum layer is hardening, where there's a kind of transition from here and here. The important one is the one coming from the paper, where as you expose longer and longer, the gum thickness or emulsion thickness is going to increase. So this is going to be a very light tone, and this is going to be a very dark tone up here. So normally what you do is, well, expose this, then develop it. But I thought, well, what's the point of developing it if the next layer, for example, let's do this a little bit smaller. So this is my, paper down here, and then I've got my first layer here. And let's say I expose up to that. And this might be like, a light gray. Well, what's the point of developing this out if I just put another layer on top of this, exposed for a shorter amount of time? So let's say this one I exposed for 30 units. Let's expose this one for 15 units. And then the tonal range is going to go from here to here. And then let's put another layer on top of this, and another layer. And all of a sudden we start to get, a full tonal scale exposing for shorter and shorter times. So 3 units, expose, 1 unit or so. And then the other thing we'll do is we'll change the recipe for each of these. So this one might be 0.1 grams of pigment. This one 0.2. Who's ever vacuuming? Could you mute your screen? Or there's so we got 0.4, 0.8, and 1.6. So you'll see what I'm doing here. All I'm doing is doubling each time. So 0 0.1, 0 0.2, 0 0.4, 0 0.8, 1.6. And then I'm just halving it, the exposure. So 30, 15, 7, it should be like, 3.5, 1.75. And if we apply that concept to this, we get a total range like this, and it's pretty good, but it's not amazing. We still have it's a little bit there's a little plateau here. There's a little bit too much of a difference between the first and second steps. So how can we adjust this? Well, let's look at the dark exposure first. So this one is with 2.5 units, gives me this. And you see that big difference between 1 and 2. So what if I increase to 4 units on this one? Well, now it's too much. I see no difference between 1 and 2. So if I go kind of in between them, go to 3 units, then I should get something that gives me a nice separation in the shadows. So what about the highlights here? How can we fix those? Well, maybe the lights here are not light enough. And when I was mixing it, I think I might have made a mistake and I might have added too much pigment to this one, which might be part of the reason. So what we could do is, half the amount of pigment here, or it actually looks pretty good up until here. So what if I just remove that exposure altogether? So let's see with having the amount of pigment, it looks like this. So now we start to see a little bit better separation. As you can see that in that top one. It's not great though. What if I just get rid of that last exposure, that first exposure? Oh, all of a sudden I get really nice separation. See that? So if I apply those two, so all I'm going to do is get rid of that first exposure and change this one from 2.5 to 3 units. And now this is my tonal range. So good separation between the whole thing. And then the other thing you want to keep in mind is the middle step here. So if you go up to 21 steps, so at 9, 10, 11 around here, it should be about 50% gray. So if it comes out all too dark, well, just add more pigment or add less pigment or increase the exposure times. And then I can kind of tell that that's 50% gray, and I know this one's 50% gray. So my step 10 here, it should be about equal to this one here. So you could also take out a spectrophotometer and do math and stuff, but really I've just been more or less guessing things, and the only math I've done here is doubling and halving. So very, very little math. And so I've got a wet plate from Barut, Peter Lynn. Oh no, are you there, Barut? I don't know if he was able to connect. So he gave me a wet collodion negative a year ago, and I never got around to printing it. So I went ahead and took this. Now I just have to match the to the density of that negative. So it turned out that this was pretty much the same. I had to increase exposure to 34 units. So if you have a really dense negative, well, you just increase your exposures. If you have a really thin negative, well, just decrease your exposures. So you can control your total scale just through the exposures. So first try, looks pretty damn good. And that's just with, more or less guessing. I didn't take out my spectrophotometer. I didn't do really any math. So then I want to be able to do this with inkjet. So I took the same exposure for this one, which was 25 units, and exposed a inkjet negative, just the highlights here, and it's all blown out. So I'd set my ink density to for the black here to 100%. So what I do, I just lowered it down until this became my new white point. So my curve in QTR is literally this. It's just a straight line. Um, if you want to print from Photoshop or whatever, it really doesn't matter. Just QTR gives you, it's kind of nice to be able to print with certain inks in one ink. So now that I've matched my to the density of my negative, I've got a good tonal range. Well, if I expose my inkjet negative, yeah, looks pretty good. It's not perfect. So I did take out my spectrophotometer and I did do a linearization to it, but it's a very slight linearization. You could just eyeball this too, or take a photo of it and kind of match it up. But I've got, in my first go, I got good separation there, decent separation, no plateaus or anything. It looks all right. So what I want to do is print this photo here. So I've just printed this out with that QTR curve, which was literally just that. And then I did a little curve in Photoshop and printed out my negative. So any questions so far before I start making a print?
I'd like to add just a little bit to the discussion yesterday about using this process with analog negatives and making separations with analog negatives, and kind of this approach that I also use for the inkjet negatives. Instead of making tonal separations, like normally what I do is, here I've got my tonal separations, like I'd treat this as one negative, treat this as another one, and treat this another. So I'd print 4 different negatives. But what I did yesterday was treat this as one negative, one image, and then what I did was I controlled the amount of pigment and the exposures to expose different parts of the tonal scale. So let's look a little bit kind of how this works. So here are the midtones, and let's zoom in on our tonal scale up here. If I were to increase the exposure here, let's go down here. And this would be easier if I set this up a little bit differently. Let's just get rid of this curves adjustment here. And this curves adjustment, we're going from 34% gray to 63% gray. So this is kind of where I'm setting my exposures or stops in an analog world. So this goes up to 63 here. So this is where I'm making my kind of separations. This is what my analog version of this would look like, more or less. I mean, I'm trying to make a digital version of an analog world, so it's not going to be exactly like this. And it's probably going to have a little tail and a little bit of shoulder to it too. But let's say that I increase the exposure. Everything's going to move towards you'll see that looking up at, we're going up to 25% gray. So as I increase the exposure here, everything is moving towards the highlights. If I were to decrease my exposure, so let's grab these up here again. Well, everything's going to move towards the shadows. So I can control what part of the negative or the tonal scale I'm going to be exposing through the exposure time. So obviously my longest exposure needs to be my highlights, because if you look at the negative here, well, what's the hardest for the light to get through? Well, the densest parts of the negative. And so these are going to require the longest exposure time. And so that will be my lights will be my longest exposure, and then so on and so forth that I go through these different exposures. I found that reducing it by about a half, a full stop, or 2/3 of a stop each time. It's going to depend on how many separations you have. But with the one I did in the presentation yesterday, I had 5 different separations. I found that I started with 25 units and then went down to 12.5 units, and so on and so forth. So each time I was halving it. So then the other variable that we can play around with is the amount of pigment. So we can control that, going back to our mids here, through this levels adjustment, which is going to be pretty much like our density. So if I were to add more pigment, well, obviously it's going to get darker. So if I were to move this over, you see how that gets darker there. If I were to move it lighter, add less pigment, it's going to get lighter. So I can control not only where the tonal scale, but also how light and dark it is by the amount of pigment. So this is good for controlling kind of overall contrast. Then within this separation here, I can also control the contrast by the thickness. So if I were to do this in, let's say, like one layer, and make one really thick layer, I'm going to cover pretty much the full tonal range here. So if I and I control the thickness of the emulsion by the dilution. So if I were to dilute the product, 1 to 2, it might be really thick. Or if I dilute it 1 to 20, it might be very, very thin, in which case the number of stops or tonal range of the negative you're going to cover is very, very small. Because if you think about the thickness of that emulsion, well, it's not going to cover that much space. So it might look something like this. So we have lots of options for controlling contrast here. And this is really incredible, because if you are working with platinum or carbon or even this, which is one layer, well, it's like, what options do you have for controlling this image? You can, control the contrast a little bit, okay, I can make a little bit more contrasty, or I can make a little bit less contrasty, but you can't necessarily focus and open up the shadows. I mean, you can a little bit, but you don't have as much control. I'm going to show you right now what you can do with this process, and it's just, you have so much more control over this. It really opens up a whole new world of interpretation if you're working with analog negatives. So I think anybody that's working with large format film should really give this a try. So let's kind of look at this. So let's say that this is our image here, and I've kind of played around with the values here, so this doesn't look exactly like it should. And this should, let's make this, I've got this nice tails and stuff on here, but so it's easier to work with, I'm just going to make this a straight line. It's not exactly how it would be in the real world, but for ease of doing this quickly in Photoshop. So this one's going from about 34% gray up to 63%. And if you're interested in learning how to do these tonal separations, digitally and making separate negatives, which works well with image center negatives, it's all in my book on calibration. So let's just move this over, and this one goes up to from 63 to 89, and then the last one here will go from 89 till the end of the tonal scale here, 89, so something like that. And I've played around with this a little bit too, so it should look about like that. It's not exactly, because I've played with these numbers, but when you set this up, it should look like your original image up here. But let's say that this is, you go and you kind of like I described yesterday, figure out the density of the negative that you're working with. So if you have a very high density, well, your exposure is going to be very long. If the density of your negatives, you have a thin negative, well, your exposure will be shorter. So you kind of adjust everything. And then also you're adjusting the pigments, and I found that dividing the exposure time by half, but then doubling the amount of pigment each time. So my first exposure, I was using, for this one, 0.1 grams of pigment. This one was 0.2 grams of pigment. This one's 0.4 and 0.8. And I actually did one more that had 1.6. So each time I was doubling. So exposure times, you're halving, and pigment, you're doubling each time. That's all it is. And all you're looking for, when I showed you that that step, Stouffer step wedge, that you're looking for the middle of that step wedge to be about 50% gray. And that should match pretty well to the contrast of your negative. So let's say that maybe I want to add a little bit of contrast, kind of maybe to the shadows of this. So I can come over to this one, and let's say that I just go from 0.4 grams of pigment up to 0.6 grams of pigment. Well, it'll do something like that. If I go up to 1.6, well, then I completely lose the shadows here, but there's not a lot of information there anyways. So I can bump this up quite a bit. And in doing so, I can really control that contrast just in the shadows. Or if I really wanted to open up, but that doesn't really make sense because there's not a lot of information here, I could do that. So you have complete control within each layer, which I think is really, really cool. Or if I wanted to, let's say, the highlights here, and then you can match these two, like anything that you can do with a curves adjustment, you're going to be able to do within these layers. So if I want to, do something like that, or reverse, I maybe want to add some texture just to, let's say, see if I can get this right here, just to the water or something. Well, you can do that, but then the cool thing is, if this were an analog negative, well, then you can just do dodging and burning, like anything that you mask out in Photoshop, you can do that manually in the analog world too. So if I wanted to, let's say, mask that out, but then increase my exposure just on this river here, well, I could just mask that out, and I can add that in with my exposure. So expose a little bit longer there, and you're good to go. So you have all these options for controlling the contrast and stuff. Maybe I want to open up the mids a little bit, make it lighter. I don't know. You can do pretty much whatever. Move that over a little bit. Maybe you want to make this lighter. I'm just kind of playing around here. So anything you can do with a curves adjustment, again, you're going to be able to do in the analog world. Anything you can do with masking, you're going to be able to do in the analog world. But then also toning. So let's say that this is just a straight black and white print, and I think this is probably the most powerful tool of this, is just your options for interpreting the tone. It's endless. So if I come over here and change this to RGB and don't merge, and then I add on top of this, let's say, a hue saturation, and then you can throw this on top of this too. And then, so yesterday what I did with the portrait is I just threw in a little bit of, or actually it hasn't happened yet, it's going to happen later in the video. So I wanted to add a duotone. So all I did was add in a little bit of iron oxide to the highlights. So if I want to do that, iron oxide maybe has the tone something like this. I can easily just add a little bit of tone to the highlights, and by doing so, I'm going to get a little bit of more antique look to it or something, a little bit more warmth. And then if I want to do a split tone, well, I might just come to my darks here, and let's add another hue saturation layer. Hue saturation, and then let's add, let's bring it out here so we can see it. And then I added violet, so something, maybe like that, maybe not so strong, and put this back together. And so then I get this little split tone between, the warmth and the cool. But you can do anything. You can add any pigments you want if you want to get pretty much any tone. If you want to add, maybe some green would work pretty well in here. Maybe this is, you want that green not on this layer down here, but maybe that green might work better up here. although it's going to be too much. So let's bring that down. And so you get the split tone between, maybe if we go a little bit more red with this. And so any options for toning, I mean, you just are, they're just endless. So in review, we can control the contrast of each layer. Anything we do with curves, we can do. Anything we do with masking, we can do. Anything to do with tone, we can do. So anything you'd really ever want to do with a black and white photo, you can do in an analog manner with an analog negative. So I think it's just really incredible how powerful this is and how many options you have.
So I've cut out some paper. So I've got a sheet of paper here for my inkjet photo that we're going to print, and then one for the white collodion. So let's go on back. And then I'm going to switch to safe lighting here. So I've got all my emulsions prepared here. And so when I sell this, I'll just sell the black, and then I'll have a clear. And then all you would need to do is mix them in different ratios. So the first one would be 15 parts clear, 1 part black. The next one would be 14 parts clear, 2 parts black. Next one would be 4 parts black, 8 parts black, and pure black. To make those dilutions. And then if you don't want to make prints in 5 layers, you want to do 3 layers or 1 layer, depending on the look you're going for, well, you know, do whatever you want. And then to apply the emulsion, I'm just using these cheap brushes from the hardware store. Like, you don't need, you know, $100 Hake brushes. Like this one's like €7 and this one's like $2.50. And another thing I wanted to do, because I did a run through of this with Michael Strickland the other day, so I've already made this print, and I know it works. But it's kind of boring to make prints the same twice. So let's do something a little bit different here. So I've got a bunch of different colors mixed up here for when I did extended gamut. So let's take out iron oxide here, and I don't know, I could mix cyan and magenta violet's just gonna be easier. I just do a split tone. And I'm just going to eyeball this as well. So let me get a brush to mix this up with. So I'm just going to add a little bit of iron oxide, make this a little bit warmer. Because this is our highlights. This is our first layer. If I wanted to see this, I could paint this on the back side here. And we could go out to the front here and see, you know, do we like that color? Is it warm enough? This is our light layer, which is pure black. This is a little warmth to it. You know, it looks all right. I might add just a tad bit more warmth to the highlights here. So that should be good. And then,
are you using the pigments that you've been selling on your site?
Yeah, and they all work really well. I had a little bit of problem with the iron oxide, but it's not a problem with the pigment itself. It's a problem with iron oxide, because I tried 10 other iron oxides and they all had the same kind of, I lose some dots. It's like 99% good, but it's not perfect. And then the black is really, really, really matte. So I'd like to have a glossy black too. It's really nice because it doesn't stain, but it's very matte. So I'll do some more research on this over the year. So I'm just going to go ahead and coat this on the paper. I've got my towel here just in case I want to remove some. And I've got a little bristle there. I'm not too concerned about it. I'll get rid of that later. And then I'm gonna put this in the room over here. I'll show you in a second. So I've got a drawing cabinet here, drawing room. And I usually just hang it, but to make it go a little bit faster, I put it on top there. So there's air coming down, so they'll dry in about 3 minutes or so. And then for the wet plate, I might be able to use this brush too. Yeah, that works just fine. This goes back.
Hi, I would like to ask a question.
Yep, go for it.
I was wondering if you've ever tried laking pigments from plant sources and using them in this process. Thank you.
You could. I kind of shy away from plant-based pigments or dyes, just because they don't tend to be very light fast, so they're going to fade quite rapidly. So if that doesn't bother you, just kind of that's what you're going for. Permanence isn't an issue for you. Yeah, that's fine. You could really mix in anything with these. So if you want to make for example, I don't know, a photo of a mug of hot chocolate out of cocoa, then you could do that. No problem. Okay. Dry this off to the next layer. But it's much more enjoyable as far as working conditions than when I was working with making gum prints, dichromate. I had my daughter in here the other day, and I wasn't worried about her, licking dichromate contaminated brushes and stuff. And it's just much more enjoyable to work with. So let's go to the front again to expose. And I've got my exposures set up for this gray, but I know that the iron oxide is going to absorb a little bit more of the ultraviolet light. So I think we're just going to add a third of a stop or something to the exposure, at least the first one. Second one shouldn't matter. So I'm just going to expose for a little bit longer, not much. That is a reference. Okay, so I've got my negatives all prepared. I've masked this out a little bit. The wet plate one, I didn't really mask out that much. And that should be dry. So I'm going to go in the back and I'm going to grab the print. And then if you remember this little thing here, I'm just going to remove it like that. And then since I'm doing a portrait, I'm going to try to not put that in her face. So I'll put her face up there. So I want to put it like that. So for registration, you could tape onto here. You can buy pins and like pre-made holes that you can pin this into. You could also just like tape the negative on and just fold it back and forth. Would work as well. I'm going to tape just a little strip at the beginning here. This is just going to make a little bit sturdier, so we get a little bit better registration. This paper has a lot of flex to it. And because we're not developing, it doesn't really, I mean, this is just delicate surface tape. It doesn't have to hold up to washing because we're not going to wash it until we're completely finished with the registration. So this goes on here, and it looks like I don't have it, not that centered. Yeah, it'll be fine. I didn't place the negative centered on this. And then for the wet plate, I have to go get that print as well. We're going to do them both at the same time, even though the densities of the negatives are different. So the exposure times are going to be different. But that's fine. I can adjust it on the fly. So here I'm going to, again, just place a little bit of sturdy support on the back. I'm just using Synapse. And that will keep my register really nice.
Excuse me, I was hoping to ask, is this process sensitive to the alkalinity buffering that's often in fine art papers?
No. I did this one backwards too. I remember this one. Let's do it this way. No, it's not going to be a problem. You can use pretty much any paper you want. I find that Hanamiel Platinum Rag works really well for this process. It's probably the paper I'll continue to use. It's nice and smooth, doesn't stain that much. This paper, I did gelatin size this one. You get a little bit less speckling in the print. I mean, it works fine without it too. So it just depends on kind of the look you're going for. So I've got these two set up, and I have to use a screen. I've just got some mesh that I put in the back. The only reason I'm using this is my, where's my big one? Oh, don't know where my big one went. This doesn't have any texture to it. So to get a good vacuum, I have to use this mosquito netting. The only reason I'm using that. And my exposure time on this is going to be 43 units. So it would have been 25, but or 34 for the far one. But because I'm using the iron oxide, I'm going to bump up the exposure a little bit. exposure for this one, for inkjet, should be 31 units. So I'm just going to cover it up. And then at 31 units, I'm just going to remove it. That way we get the two different exposures. All right, so that was 39 seconds. I think last time was only 22. And then each time it's going to be halved. So that's the longest exposure. So you're not going to see a latent image on this. There's no self-masking with this. There's no sensitizer staining, so you can't see an image. But it has been hardened, so when I play the next layer on here, you will see the image start to form a little bit. So go back here. And all we're going to do is we're going to repeat what we just did 4 more times. So now I'm going from 0.1 grams of pigment up to 0.2.
Would you be able to explain what the solutions are again? Because I only got to join in now and I couldn't join in at the beginning.
Yeah, so I've got 5 different emulsions. And they're just increasing in pigment amount. So going from 0.1 grams of pigment, 0.2, 0.4, 0.8, and 1.6. So they're just doubling each time. And the reason I'm doing that is because each time I'm halving the exposure. So that way I can get a nice total separation in my image. So this one, I'm not going to add any iron oxide to it. I think we'll be good with just that in the highlights. Way too much on there. And now I'm going to throw this up in the cabinet to dry again. And then we'll grab for the wet plate. And you'll be able to see it more and more. Actually, you can't see what I'm doing. I was coding over here. So you can start to see the outline of the image a little bit, but not much. I'll throw this in the drying. And then again, this just gets stored. It'd be nice to have, if you're doing a lot of prints, to have 5 different brushes, so you don't have to clean the brush in between each one. And this process works really well for making, like, I've calculated that I could probably make about 40 8x10 prints in a day with this process, because it's just coat, hang it up, coat, hang it up, coat, hang it up. Whereas with carbon, it takes me like 3 days to make 1 print. So it works really well for making series of prints or large editions. So when I do workshops next year with the process, instead of 4 people, I'm going to do workshops of 8. That way I can lower the price. Instead of $2,200 for 10 days, I'll do probably $1,200 for 10 days. Or if we do 5-day workshops, then $600. But I'm not sure if in 5 days, I mean, if it's just black and white. So I'm not sure if I'll do 5-day workshops or 10-day workshops. So I'll send out an email and people can respond with what
Calvin?
Yep.
Yeah. Just to be clear, so everything that you're working with, both your pigments and your emulsion, these are all your proprietary pigments and your new emulsion or your new sensitizer.
Correct. Yep.
Just to be clear, also, would these techniques would you be able to use them on what I'd call conventional gum, like ammonium dichromate and regular watercolor pigments?
Yeah. So the idea is, okay, so the pigments you can use with gum and dichromate. That's fine. But trying to get away from using dichromate. So with the new emulsion, yeah, you can use my pigments, or you can mix in other pigments. I haven't tested if it's compatible with gum. So if you're using watercolors, if you'd be able to use that, I'm not totally sure. I wouldn't advise it either way. It's just watercolors are so expensive. I mean, you're paying like 15 euros for like 0.1 grams of pigment. It's just ridiculous. So it makes more sense to buy the pure pigment or dispersion from Kramer or Kama or Gara pigments or something, or just powder pigments are gonna, be a lot cheaper than using watercolors. So watercolors I don't really recommend. Although, yeah, I just use this new emulsion with just pure pigments. And then can you use my pigments with the old traditional methods? Yeah, you can too. Did that answer your question?
Thank you, Calvin. Did.
Yeah.
I have a question here, if you could answer that. What are the stain properties of the new emulsion? Does it stain like bichromate? Can you print on unsealed papers?
Can you repeat the question again? I'm having trouble hearing you.
What are the stain properties of the new emulsion? Can you print on plain papers?
Yeah, you can print on any paper you want. That's not a problem.
But do you, in your examples, are your papers filled with gelatin like for your gum printing?
Yeah, it's going to work just like a drop-in replacement for gum. So anything you can do with gum printing, you can do with this. But it's just going to be easier with this because you don't have the dark reaction. So if you, like, I'm coating here and then exposing, but let's say I had to leave or something, I could coat and then come back the next day. And it's fine. Like if you're like halfway through these 5 steps, if you can get to step 3 and then have to do something, come back, it's just fine. There's no dark reaction. It makes calibration much easier. And then just because of all those other things, abrasion resistance and stability, it's just a lot easier to work with. But it's just a pretty much drop-in replacement for gum.
What about stain?
Staining?
Staining, yes. That was my the pigment staining.
Yeah, the pigment staining of the pigments. Yes, the pigment staining is about the same. There's not much difference between this and gum.
Okay.
And then sensitizer staining. This has no sensitizer staining.
Yeah. I got that. Thank you.
Yep. So let's go to the front again and set our exposures for. This is our second layer.
And this is going to be available when, Calvin, in 2024?
Yeah, so
I'm going to be dead by then,
Yeah, so my plan, the problem is getting certifications. So I'm ready to start selling this. I've got a little bit more research to do, but I'd probably be ready by February to sell it. But I can't. My idea is to be able to sell it on Amazon in the US, so people don't have to pay 40 euros for shipping from Spain. It'd be like 9.50 for package shipping on Amazon. It's free in the US. So it'll be very, very accessible to people, easy to try. Um, so I'm just going to offer it to people who've taken workshops with me that I know, or who are taking the gum workshops or the printmaker's friend this year. And then I'll offer them, okay, you can buy up to 10 kilos of product. So that's my plan for this year. And then 2024, I'll start selling it to the public.
Quick question in regards to, because it's not using dichromates and such, would that be okay to be disposed down any waste?
Yeah.
Or
Yeah, so yep, it's completely biodegradable. The packaging is going to come in biodegradable packaging as well. Everything is like super eco-friendly with it. So that's kind of the main thing I'm trying to do with this is just make it really non-toxic and eco-friendly.
And how does this relate to carbon printing? Is the idea that this is the whole process is superior?
Yeah, so it doesn't replace carbon printing. They're two different. This is going to replace gum printing. So carbon printing it's still. I mean this. It depends on the look you're going for. So I'll show you in a minute here after I expose this, kind of the texture between a carbon print and a print made with a printmaker's friend, with this kind of gum alternative. I mean, you're going to get brush strokes in here. You're going to have more texture. It's going to be a more kind of, I don't know, rustic, pictorials. I don't know. It's the look of a gum print, is what you're going to get from this. Whereas carbon, I mean, you can interpret carbon in many different ways, but for me, carbon is more very, I don't know, technical and precise. And so you're not going to have brush strokes and you're not going to have the kind of like I had things and stuff, and I'm not worried about those in this process. But it's however you want to interpret the two processes. I mean, you can make pretty much any kind of look. But I'll show you in a minute here when I can turn the lights on the textural difference between the two, and that'll make a lot of sense.
And just as a follow-up, can you, in your book, you sprayed the emulsion on instead of brushing? Can you do that with this as well?
I suppose so. I don't think it's necessary though, and it doesn't really make any sense anymore, because the reason I was spraying the emulsion was because if you put down a layer, and then let's say cyan, and then you try to do magenta over that, you brush up the previous layer. It has very little abrasion resistance, gum does. Whereas this, when you put on the second layer, you don't remove the layers underneath. So it kind of doesn't make sense to spray it anymore. You're going to get deep, rich colors without spraying.
Thanks.
So we're going to do 20 units on the wet plate, and then 14.5 on the inkjet. Now you notice that I haven't been developing between each layer. I'm just layer on top of layers, which won't work in color printing, but for black and white, I think it works quite well.
So you definitely need a registration.
No, no.
Because I usually use a light table to register by eye, but if the image doesn't show up.
Yeah, you could, your options are to, you could tape your negative on here and then just fold your negative back and kind of cover it up while you coat the next layer. And then once it's dry, fold your negative that way. But an easier way, if you don't have a punch, on Turner's Burton, they sell clips that you can just tape on. So they're just like little squares that have the punch in them. So you just buy the pins and the punches. So you just tape those on the paper and that's it. So you don't need a punch or anything. So with, you know, €4 or €5, you have a registration system.
Also, can you do it in a dim room or do you actually need safe light?
I did a test this morning where I exposed it for 5 minutes with light at 450 nanometers, which is blue, and there's no exposure whatsoever. So I think you'd be able to work in pretty much any, as long as it doesn't have, you know, a lot of short wavelengths in your lighting. You should be able to work in white light, but I need to do more tests with that too. So now we're jumping up to 0.4 grams of pigment.
You know, this reminds me a little bit of what Irving Penn was doing with palladium printing, where he was doing the multi-layer palladium prints to get the nice range that he was getting in prints.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the closest would be, for me, there's a carbon printer, Gordon Chappelle. He would make multi-layer carbon prints, kind of like what I showed at the beginning. I don't know how he did it, but that was kind of my recreation of that, was through the exposures. I don't know if what Irving's approach to this was, whether he would change exposure time with each layer, or if you just, you know, coat once, expose, coat again. I don't know what his technique was. Yep.
Well, I have a real dumb question. I have to apologize to the group, but you said you could only do this for like monochromes, like black and white or red and
no. I'm saying this layering method that I'm doing.
Yes.
So you're going up in the layer, and then the next one's kind of going on top of that, and the next one's going on top of that.
What could you use with CMYK or a color separation?
Yeah. So imagine that your first layer, you do yellow. And let me grab an image just to be easier to understand. So let's say that you're so let's say I do my magenta first, and then I do my cyan on top of that. So let's say I coat this with magenta, expose it, and then I don't develop, I put my cyan on top of that. What's going to happen in the sky? My cyan is on top of my magenta, and there's no magenta in the sky. So the magenta is going to melt, and that will carry the cyan away with it. So it doesn't really work in color. You'd have to develop it in between each layer. Within the layer, if you want to do cyan itself in 3 different exposures, that's fine. You can do light cyan, medium cyan, dark cyan within the same negative, develop, and then do your next layer on top of that. But because of the way we're ramping up those colors in black and white, it works. But in color, because it's more, you have patches of color around it, it just doesn't, it's not going to work. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you, Calvin, and thank you to the group for a silly question.
No, it's a good question. So So then our next exposure here is 11.4 units. So I really like these integrators from InLeak. They're really nice. So we're gonna go 11.4. Yep. And then 8.4 for the other one. And then my exposures are gonna get too short. So now we're gonna jump down to about 8 seconds, which is too hard to control. So I'm going to cover up half my exposure unit with this artwork that my daughter made. She's in here. So at some point when I send a print to a client, the client's going to get this piece of artwork. It's like,
Calvin, how long does the emulsion last when it's made up? You know, you're storing it in the drawer there.
It should last years, in theory. I obviously haven't been able to test that though, so. So that's something to test, but it should last a long time. So. Clean up this.
I spoke with Richard Sullivan a few years ago about the lifespan of biochemistry, and he said, well, do you want your answer in minutes, years, or centuries?
Yeah, so if it's the chromate itself is going to last pretty much forever, but as soon as it's mixed up, then it's not going to last long at all. It's going to immediately, a dark reaction is going to start immediately. So that's where in the book, that's where I was, adding sodium hydroxide and doing all the work with ammonia, and it was just nasty to work with. Developing an ammonia, just ugh. Or is this for developing? Like developing is just plain tap water.
And I have another question here. So in principle, for your monochrome work, you can develop each layer to judge the progress that you're making, and then you can start with the darkest layer or whatever combination, right?
Say it one more time. I'm just really having trouble hearing you.
Okay, so for monochrome work, you can develop each layer after each exposure to judge visually what you're putting on, and then dark layer and add layers on top, right?
Yeah,
like
that's what. Yeah, and that's what I'd kind of recommend. Maybe kind of doing this separately to kind of get an idea of, okay, how is this tone range going to go together? However, there is one problem with this, is I'm going up to 1.6 grams of pigment in here per 10 grams of product, which is just insane. It's a pigment loading that's just, I mean, it's, you'd never in your right mind ever use a pigment loading that high, because it's going to stain a lot. And when I say a lot, I mean it's pretty incredible. I'll show you. So this is the staining that I'm going to get if I just coat the 1.6 directly on the paper, like it's my first layer. There's a lot of staining. So why am I not getting as much staining on this? Well, if we go back to our little drawing here, what's in contact with the paper? Oh, the emulsion that has 0.1 grams of pigment. So this is what would cause the pigment staining is whatever emulsion is in contact with the paper. And because that one with 1.6 grams is far away from the paper, it's not going to stain the paper, so you'll get nice highlights. So doing it in this way prevents staining, and you can use really, really high concentrations of pigment.
So your light layer is basically like the sheets for everything else and a barrier for the staining. Very good.
Yeah. It's kind of like what I call the clear coat in the book.
Yeah.
Is going to be the same kind of thing.
Okay.
So going back to the previous question between
of your emotion, right? Just plain emotion.
Yeah. So going back to the question about texture. So here's carbon print. So very, very smooth tones. And then here's the PrintMaker's friend. So you see that difference between kind of how smooth the tones are. You get a little bit more of the paper texture in there. So what does that look like in a print? Well, here you're going to get a little bit of texture, kind of the skies and things like that. Whereas in a carbon print, and this isn't the best comparison for color, but this is made with earth pigments. But you see how smooth that is. Whereas this is going to have more texture to it. See that? So whether that adds to a photo or not, well, it depends on the photo, depends on your style of photography, what you're trying to achieve. So another one, you kind of see that little bit of texture in there. And this is something that you can control if you want more brush strokes, if you want more pigment stain. Well, you can control the process to get those effects too, if you want more of them. Let's go ahead and expose our fourth layer here. Our third layer. So 11.4 units. So I'm going to go grab the paper. And you can start to see the image a little bit. Not much, but you can kind of see like that's her face. And then in this one, see like there's a little kind of railroad sign there. Not much, but a little bit. Because the hardened emulsion is not going to absorb as much as the unhardened. So you actually start to get a negative image as the unhardened parts of the image are absorbing more emulsion as you're applying the next layers. And I've never tried this technique with gum printing, of doing multiple layers like this and not developing in between. In theory, it should work with gum too. I don't know, has anybody ever tried this before?
Sorry, you're saying gum, but do you mean carbon?
Oh, gum.
No, I'll let you know tonight, Calvin.
Okay.
By the way, there is a question that somebody asked about where was the sensitive component in your mixes?
Yeah, I'm not gonna disclose that yet. So whether I go ahead and take out a patent on this,
no, I think not so much what, but where. And you've got black beakers of black liquid.
Oh, it's mixed in. So this all comes pre-sensitized, so you don't have to do anything. So
Except to add
all you
pigment.
do, yeah.
Okay.
In theory, they'll come pre-mixed with pigment too. So like literally, you'll just pour out from the tube and brush it on. Like that's it. So my idea is that this is going to kind of replace, you know, maybe even cyanotype as being like an introductory to alternative processes because it's just so easy.
So I have to give up my gold ochre?
No, I'll get a clear emulsion too. So they'll come, you know, I'll probably first come out with cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, and maybe iron oxide. And then if you want to use those pigments, go for it. But then I'll also have the clear emulsion. So if you want to use that to mix up whatever pigments you want, whether plant-based or you know, mineral pigments or special effect for less, or you know, whatever, you can mix those up.
Bless you, Calvin. Thank you.
So now we're on to 0.8 grams. And remember, I want to do a split tone. So let's just throw in a little bit of violet here, which is going to darken the image and the shadows a little bit too, because this is really intense. I could add a little bit of clear to this, but I kind of wanted to darken a little bit in the shadows. So I think this will be just fine. So you'll see these are going to get much darker as I start applying these.
Is your emulsion sensitive to heat and humidity like gum?
No. Doesn't seem to be. And it shouldn't be. So all those things are going to have to do with the dark reaction, and this has no dark reaction, so it's not going to be an issue. And that's one of the beautiful things too. Like for calibration issues, like me drying this, you see, I'm not controlling the drying of this that much. Like if it's still a little bit humid or whatever, I'm not really concerned about it that much.
Calvin, somebody said in the comments or in the chat, if this doesn't contain gum, is this not a new alternative process?
Yeah, I mean, you could think of it as a new process, but I think we named too many new processes. Like as far as gum and direct carbon and fresol, like all these for me are the exact same process. All you're doing is taking a colloid and adding pigment to it and some sort of sensitizer and painting it on paper. So the process itself is the exact same. It's just whatever you're using to create the process is different. So casing or whatever. So I don't really consider, I consider all these as direct pigment prints. So that's gum, casing, direct carbon, this one. I'll consider them the same process. So when somebody comes out with a new sensitizer or something like that, and then names it like a new process, I mean, sure, but I'm not really, I'm not really that school.
Kelvin, are you using a synthetic binder or colloid?
It's so whether I'll talk about this, like hold off on that question for about a year or so.
Okay. Okay.
So I've got a so let's go to the front here. So this again, whether I decide to take out a patent on this or not, I probably won't. I don't know. But this is a good book. Where did my book go? I just put it away, and my book seems to have disappeared. Handbook of seriously. Into the systems, color here, color separations. Oh, I've got it at home. That's why. I've got a handbook of natural and synthetic gums and resins, which is a really good resource. But I don't have it here. So let's flip this around.
Can you send me the title if you have some time?
Yeah,
later?
yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I had some good success with pyrrolidone, polyvinyl pyrrolidone. So that's
okay.
I guess. Just
so we're up 6.6 units now, and this is going to be harder and harder to control. So I'm going to actually start covering these lights up to reduce the intensity of my exposure unit, because 1200 watts is kind of ridiculous for the sensitivity of this product. So to reduce it down to about 300 watts here. And then got probably another minute while that dries. I do want to wash my brush again. For the last time. Yeah, there's a lot of, I mean, over the years I was researching, I came up with a bunch of different processes that somewhat work. Like they maybe don't have much staining. They're very stable. They're easy to work with, but maybe it requires development in hot water, or likewise, you might be able to develop it in cold water, but the total range it's too short, or there's a lot of staining with it, or the shelf life isn't correct. So it's just, there's like those 5 things that I talk about in the video at the beginning of this presentation, that you need to check off all these boxes to have a actual replacement for gum. Because I mean, we've been working on this for I don't know how many years, and with the diazins and stuff like that, they work sort of, but nobody's really decided to. Let me flip this around here so you can see me. Use these in their or to replace gum in the processes, because they just have so many problems with them. So I think this I can't think of any real problems with this, except I don't know. As far as cost, it should be pretty much the same as working with gum and watercolors. Might be just a little bit more expensive. But maybe from a historical perspective, like if you were, trying to, be as true to that historical process of gum printing as possible, yeah, maybe. But I don't. The end result is going to be pretty much identical. So. Flip this around. I'm gonna go grab the print, see if it's dry. And on my coating on the inkjet, I think it's the flu. I'm just going a little bit slow today. I'm coating a little bit too thick on that. I can kind of see. So I think this one might come out just a little bit too dark, but that actually kind of will work kind of well. I think it might work better just a little bit darker. Where's my on the floor here? And I actually didn't like the section on that one. The paper had a little bit of curl to it. So ideally what you'd want to do is have like a piece of wood or something flat that you can put on top of this before you pull the section, and that's going to hold that paper flat before the suction starts. That will give you a better registration. So 6.6 and 4.9 units. All right, and now we're on to our last layer. And then again, like if this is too slow for you, you want to make prints in one layer, 2 layers, or 3 layers, you can do that too. You don't have to do it in 5 layers. And if you want to do even more layers, go for it too. You could also, like after this last layer, if you want to start adding gloss layers to add depth to certain areas, or if you want to do paint in different colors to specific areas, you could after doing this one. So let's see where my bins are. Now we're up to 1.6 grams of pigment in this one. You see that I'm drawing these layers in about 3 to 5 minutes, so they're quite thin. So you see this one, that even though it's quite thin, it is very, very black. I mean, 1.6 grams.
What's the temperature of your darkroom at the minute?
It's probably about 72 degrees Fahrenheit, 22 Celsius, usually. Yep.
Thank you.
At 40% humidity right now, 41%. So quite dry. Spain is nice for that. Keeping a dry studio. And then for the wet plate, instead of using black on this last layer, I'm kind of curious what would happen if we used just straight up violet. So it's maybe a little bit light, so let's add a little bit of black. Not super technical on this. All right.
Would there be a maximum humidity level for working with this?
No, you could work anything. It would just take longer. And this is much more like gum. If you're working at 80% humidity, if you don't dry it enough, you run into problems if it's sticking to negative, destroying your negative and stuff like that. Whereas this, it's not as tacky as gum. So you don't run into much problem with that. Like I haven't had this stick to a negative yet. I did one where it wasn't completely like the drip mark and wasn't completely dry. But it didn't stick, it just kind of smudged. So I guess that's another benefit of this. So then after we expose this, then we're on to development and we're finishing the print. This is the last step because there's no sensitizer staining, there's no need for clearing or anything at the end of this. So it's just develop and you're done. And developing, again, it's just tap water. I want this to be I find 22 degrees Celsius, 72 Fahrenheit seems to work pretty well. But you can develop in water at any temperature. Older, it's just going to take longer. I'll do both of these at the same time. And I'm going to develop them face down. That way the pigment drops out quicker, so I want quite a bit of water in here. So maybe one a little bit too hot. And yeah, so I've been kind of comparing this to carbon printing throughout the presentation, just because I'm a carbon printer. I'm not really a gum printer. But this is more of a drop-in replacement for gum, not for carbon.
Will you be extending it to carbon printing? Like, does this, like, the product now is gum and sensitizer, but will you be selling just the sensitizer? Or?
I've tried it, but I've had some issues with it adhering. So I'm going to work on trying to figure that out. But it kind of requires some complexities in making the emulsion. Like you have to make emulsions with various layers within the emulsion, which isn't impossible to do, but it's difficult with the setup I have. So whether it'd be really nice to get rid of using DOS in carbon printing, because then you don't have problems with nitrogen bubbles. You don't have problems with self-masking or the staining, and you don't have to clear it. The cost, trying to find the stuff, because it's just harder to find because nobody makes CRTs anymore. So it'd be nice to find a good replacement, but I haven't totally figured out how to make it work yet. But for now, it's just going to replace gum. So we got another minute here while we wait for the emulsions dry. Any other questions?
Is there any yellowing with time? Like, for example...
In theory, no. According to my handbook, the base for this is quote, extremely resistant to yellowing over time. So I haven't done a yellowing test. That's something that's on my I think of things to research. There's just always more research to do. But in theory, it shouldn't yellow with time. It should be very resistant to yellowing.
Are you thinking of working with Wilhelm Research to test the longevity of these prints?
Yeah, probably with Arterberg, but yeah, I'll have more for the pigments. I usually do my own light fastness testing just because I live in Spain, so it's cheap. I just stick it out in the sun for a few months. and see what happens. So I do quite a bit of pigment testing that way. And I've tested various additives and things for gum or for carbon printing, sorry. And it's pretty obvious pretty quickly, like what biocides you add or what additives, surfactants. Some of them yellow really, really quickly. And it becomes very obvious just putting on the sun for a couple months. So it's something that I can do myself here in Spain because it's just so much sun.
Another question, are there any pigment which is forbidden in this process? Like, for example, making things brittle? I don't know, for example, in oil, now we know that it's not advisable to use zinc oxide. So is there any...
Exactly, yep.
Is there any thing like that?
In theory, it should be quite resistant to reactions like that. The base is quite inert, and it's very, very good at preventing oxidization and stuff like that. But whether the reactions that happen, I mean, in paint manufacturing, they came out with titanium oxide and then zinc oxide stuff. They ran into a lot of problems with, on houses, paint peeling off like the first, lead white. Like one of the advantages is it would peel off and then you get like a new white underneath kind of thing. So whether some pigments cause problems down the line, yeah, maybe. But in general, if you're using tolucyanine, cyan, quinacridone magenta, and bismuth vanadate yellow, like the standard pigments, you shouldn't have any problems with those. But if you start going kind of outside of those standard pigments, yeah, it's possible that there's reactions could happen. So I'm gonna go grab the print here. And then again, to kind of show how these separations are working, I'm going to go, this is going to be a very short exposure. So light is only going to make it through the very lightest parts of negatives, like where the negative is dark. It's not going to be able to make it through, so it's not going to expose it. So the lightest parts, most transparent, is going to expose that, and those are going to be the darkest parts of the image. So I just want a very, very short exposure. So I'm going to do 3 units at this point. And I'm going to cover up one more here. So now we're down to just a 100-watt exposure unit. And so I've got this thing at like 10 feet away from my frame here. So if you had like just a cheap 50-watt, you could make prints, this large if you put it, a third that distance. And your exposure times for the longest one might be like 5 minutes, but that's still reasonable. So it's really nice because, I mean, exposure like that is going to cost you like 3,000 euros, whereas one of those cheap 50-watt ones on AliExpress or something, 20 bucks. And this integrator is great because I'm changing the intensity of my light source, but this is giving me the same exposures because that's reading the intensity of that light and adjusting the exposure times to that intensity. If you don't have a integrator, a stopwatch will work just fine. You just have to make sure that, your intensity of your light source is constant. So these are done. I could take off this tape at this moment. It might be better to do it when it's wet. Yeah, I think I'm going to do it when it's wet. Yeah. It's delicate tape, but it kind of rips a little bit. Don't really care that much. Wet plate here.
Could you go a little bit into your UV exposure unit setup? Because I've never seen it before.
Yeah, it's in the. I've got a whole chapter in the book on gum printing on this guy. So this one is LED, 385 nanometers, 390 nanometers, and then I've got a metal halide here too, which is actually what I use for most of my work. It's just about 800 watts, but it has a peak around 365 nanometers. So just give me a little bit different contrast in the process for carbon printing. But for this, the longer, 390 nanometers seems to work better, and they're much cheaper as far as LEDs at that wavelength. So that's good. So I'm gonna throw these in here. And again, this is just tap water. I don't know if you can see what's going on here. And this will take about 5 minutes or so. So you see that in the water, I don't know if you can see it, pigment's starting to release, or the emulsion is starting to melt, I should say. Here you can start to see the image a little bit here. Feel free to ask questions if you want while I'm developing. Doesn't really require much effort. Starting to see the image a little bit. I think this one's about done. So I'll put the clean water here. So I'll say that one's done. So I'm going to go hang this one up.
And what happens if you leave the printing water for too long?
it shouldn't be too much of a problem. You might run into some problems with reticulation. As the emulsion absorbs too much water.
Say, Calvin, did you size your paper?
Yeah, this has a gelatin size on it, but it's fine if you use just hand mill platinum white right out of the box. It works pretty well. What I'd like to do is test the sizing with a clear product, with the actual emulsion, to coat it, then expose it, and have that as my size. I think will work quite well.
Hi, Calvin. This is Aaron.
Hello.
Hey, I have a quick question. So, what you're doing right now, did you write it on your gum printing book? Because I didn't buy it yet, because I don't know anything about gum printing. I want to learn about gum printing maybe from someone from local first, and then I'm gonna read what you wrote, because I read about like your gum printing book has to be like, at least I have to have like some sort of basic knowledge, right?
Yeah, it's probably best. Not really that much of an introductory book, but it has a lot of good stuff in there. But yeah, you've got the right approach. I'd start with taking a local workshop first would be good.
Yeah, but what you're doing right now, like the layering method, did you write it on your book as well?
Sort of, but there's this technique of not developing in between. This is new. I just came up with this the other day. So here's our wet plate. Looks really nice. And then here's our, apart from inkjet. So we got, nice tones in our whites there. Pretty good registration in our eyes there. And then let's go grab a print from the other day when I did my run through with Michael to see the difference between a split tone and a straight print. So it's going to be a little bit different. This is going to be a little bit darker. I add a little bit more bump to the blacks in this one. Actually, let me just put this down so I can hang these up. That way I can just put it side by side. Okay. So here's a split tone, which I really like. That turned out just really nice compared to just straight black and white. And then this too looks much better with the split tone in there than just straight black and white. And to create that split tone, I mean, you saw I just added a little bit by eye of iron oxide and some vinyl into the shadows, and that's it. Like, so if you're making platinum prints and you want to tone a platinum print, you just want to do gum over, it's going to be really easy too with this process. So yeah, so that's pretty much it. Any questions?
How do we get on the mailing list for workshops?
Good question. I'll just post something on my Instagram. So just look on my Instagram account, the wet print. I'll post something in the gum group as well. So when I post something, then I'll give contact information to email me. And if you want to email me just directly at calvin.greer@gmail.com, you can. And I'll put you on the list.
Calvin, I just had a quick question. I came in, I caught the last 48 minutes of it.
Okay.
And I wasn't sure what I saw. Were you using a single negative?
Yeah, single negative.
You were not using multiple negatives. Okay. Because I've seen what you've done with multiple negatives and it's mind blowing.
Yeah. So Yeah, so I'm doing tonal separation. So one way is you do tonal separations through various negatives,
Right.
or if you're working with an analog negative, it's it's hard to make like the wet plate collodion one that I was working off of. It's hard to make multiple
Exactly.
ones. So here, this is I was trying to reproduce what Gordon Chappelle was doing in carbon back in the 90s. So here I'm just controlling the exposure to control where the tone is placed in the print. So if I do multiple exposures, for the lights and darks, and then control that amount of time,
Sure.
well, then I can get a full tonal range to my print.
Right.
And so that's what I'm doing here. I'm doing a short exposure for my darks, a long exposure for my highlights, and then putting those together, and I get a full tonal range like that.
Okay. Thanks.
That makes sense.
Thanks.
Yep.
I'll have to get the secret reveal from the beginning in the tape. So
yeah.
Thank you.
I'll post this video to YouTube tomorrow. Any other questions?
So, would you be able to go a little bit over what you did at the beginning? Because some of us weren't here at the start. Would you be able to do that, or would that be just to look at it tomorrow on the YouTube?
Yeah, just watch it on YouTube tomorrow. I've got the flu right now, so I'm probably just gonna go lay down after this. So yeah, it's just all I did at the beginning is kind of explain how I was making those tonal separations, and then also I just put up a video which I'm also going to post to Facebook or to YouTube, showing what properties this process has. So it's just like an introductory video.
Thank you so much, Kevin. I'm
Hey.
Korea.
Yep.
Yeah. So great.
Thanks.
I think you are more and more younger.
I don't know about that. Having a 2-year-old kind of adds a few years, I think. Oh. Any other questions before I sign off here?
Hey, thank you very much, Calvin. You are a genius, and appreciate everything.
Thanks. Genius, I don't know, but hardworking. That's for sure.
Well, thank you very much.
Thanks. All right. Well, I'm going to sign off and go lay down. Thank you, everybody, for attending. And yeah, stay tuned. I'll publish some things about the PrintMaker's Friend. I've got a website, Instagram account, and all that set up too. So I'll post more things to that once I get it set up. But I'll post links on the gum group and on my Instagram. So, all right, take care.
Thanks, Calvin.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.